Beloved brothers and sisters in Christ, Christos Anesti, Christ is risen. Truly He is risen. On this bright day of the resurrection of the Lord, I greet you with deep love and ineffable joy, and I express to you my warmest wishes for the celebration of a Pascha full of joy and renewed hope. This is a Pascha of joy and jubilation, because in spite of the sorrows, difficulties, and impasses which we face, we celebrate the resurrection of Christ, His definitive victory over evil, sin, and death. He experienced the most horrendous death. He suffered the ruthless attack of the evil. He tasted the worst rejection by His own people. He was crucified, but He is risen. He defeated evil and death. He liberated us from the tyranny of sin and guilt. This is the reason why today the joy fills our hearts, and we can chant in our churches, everything in the whole creation is filled with joy, having experienced the resurrection of Christ. We as believers in Him and members of His church, we share such a universal experience of the resurrection. Therefore, we celebrate the Pascha as the supreme feast of ineffable joy. But on this great and most holy day, we celebrate not only a Pascha of indescribable joy, but also a Pascha of renewed hope. After the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ, there is hope for a better tomorrow, for a better world, and a better future worthy of the human beings as sons and daughters of God. It has been said that hope is something which dies last after anything else. Yet, in the case of Pascha, hope never dies, because it is integrally and inseparably connected with the resurrection of Christ, the definitive overcoming of any and all kinds of death. It stays alive and dynamic under any dark circumstances, abundantly illumined with the eternal light of the resurrection, which permeates everything. Let us therefore, beloved brothers and sisters, on this great day of Pascha, fill our hearts with ineffable joy and renewed hope, and embrace and greet each other with a superb greeting which is symbolic of life and resurrection, the fully triumphant Christ is risen. Truly, He is risen.
Welcome to the television series entitled Discovering Orthodox Christianity. I'm Stacey Spanos, your host for these programs, which are designed to explain the basic teachings of Orthodox Christianity. We're honored to be filming at the Holy Cross Chapel on the campus of Hellenic College, Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in beautiful Brookline, Massachusetts. And we know that you'll learn so much about our faith and traditions. So in today's program, we'll discuss the Bible in the Orthodox Church, specifically the Old Testament. Our guest on the program is Reverend Dr. Harry Pappas, pastor of Archangels Greek Orthodox Church in Stamford, Connecticut, and adjunct professor at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary in Yonkers, New York. Father Pappas is a specialist in the Old Testament, having earned his PhD in the subject. So thank you and welcome.
It's good to be here.
First of all, who wrote the Old Testament, Father Pappas?
Traditionally, the Old Testament was written by the prophet and lawgiver Moses, the first 5 books, then by other figures as the prophet Isaiah, the king and prophet King David, Solomon, his successor, and many other of the prophetic figures and wisdom figures that are recorded in Scripture. We know on the basis of a lot of contemporary scholarship that while traditional authorship has been assigned to these very important figures, that oftentimes there are portions of the Old Testament that we are simply not aware who exactly wrote it, even if they were ascribed to these major figures like Moses and David and Isaiah.
So how did it come into existence?
It started through storytelling. The best that we can gather, maybe about 4,000 years ago, about the time that the patriarch Abraham had been called by God out of what is now present-day Iraq, and to travel to a land that he did not know. From then, the stories began about God's interaction with Abraham's family and lineage and the people that came from them, the people of ancient Israel, the people from whom Jesus Christ came. And from storytelling, there emerged the recording of events like the call of Abraham, stories about the creation, the Exodus in Egypt, the wilderness wanderings, the establishment in Canaan, where the promised land. And then from royal decrees, once God's people were set up with their own government, then sayings of prophets that were either written down during their lifetime or after that, as well as recording of wisdom figures like Solomon in books like the Proverbs.
Do we know at what point it was bound into book format and disseminated to the masses?
We don't have any reliable record with exactitude, but the best that we've been able to establish, with the result of a lot of contemporary scholarship, as well as ancient wisdom, is that the first part and most significant part, traditionally, the Torah or the law, really came into being in the Babylonian exile about 580 years before Christ was born. Then there were other writings of prophets, recordings of the kings, chronicles, and wisdom literature that came about in ensuing, that were finalized in centuries that followed the Babylonian exile.
Who are the most important figures in the Old Testament?
Without a doubt, the most important figures would be Adam and Eve, the first created human beings, then Noah, above all, Abraham, as the first called of God's people and the father of all believers, David, the first king of Israel, Moses, the prophet and lawgiver, and the prophet Isaiah. Those would be the greatest of the figures of the Old Testament.
What are some of the most important events to come out of the Old Testament?
Without a doubt, the event of the Exodus from Egypt is the event of the Old Testament. It is the time when God's people had been oppressed for hundreds of years in Egypt, and they were liberated by a God who finally heard their prayers of a cry out of this oppression to lead them through Moses, through many acts of deliverance, to cross the Red Sea, to go through the wilderness wandering, to inherit the promised land. After that, the most significant event would be the Babylonian exile, when God's people, the southern kingdom of Judah, were taken into exile about 580 years before Christ was born, because that was the greatest tragedy that ever happened. And from those events or rather I should say in between those events, the most significant thing would have been the establishment of kingdom and kingship with David, because David as Messiah, which refers in the Old Testament not to a future figure, but to a reigning anointed king to govern his people in this world, in this life. From that time, from that establishment, comes the dynamic of who is Messiah that will finally fulfill David and finally bring God's rule and reign in this life.
What books do you believe are the most important when it comes to studying the Old Testament?
In my estimation, the books of Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, the Psalms, and Isaiah would be the most important parts of the Old Testament for us.
And why?
Genesis lays the foundations of creation, of what it means to be human, of the original state in which we're created, how we corrupted and lost that great privilege, what God kept doing to restore and heal us to our promised inheritance, and how that works itself out through the call of Abraham and his successors, his descendants, Isaac and Jacob and the people of Israel. Exodus, because it records the call of Moses, the deliverance of God's people from the Exodus, and the beginning of the movement to Promised Land. Deuteronomy, because it's the summary of God's teachings and commandments that establishes how they are to live forever, and includes many important things that look towards taking possession of the Promised Land and living as a settled people. The book of Psalms, because that's the most quoted in the New Testament, and it is the heart of Orthodox worship, and is the book of prayer from which we learn how to pray. And Isaiah, because he's considered by the great fathers of the church to be the fifth evangelist, because from that book more is gleaned and pertains to the life, and especially the passion, death, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
The New Testament seems to have a feeling of love and compassion. These are the teachings of Jesus. In the Old Testament, God seems vengeful and angry. Why is that?
The Old Testament records a far longer period of history than does the New, and includes God's revelation at a particular time and place for a particular people. So therefore, it does not contain the fullness of all that God has to reveal, but while there are times where God does appear to be angry and vengeful and wrathful, there are many other portions of the Old Testament that are simply not known, where God is extraordinarily loving and compassionate and forgiving. The Old Testament, over a much longer period of time, was written where God's people were in circumstances that involved warfare, conquest, dealing with hostile powers, dealing with foreign religious traditions that were alien and threatening to their own viability as the unique, separated people of God. The New Testament, by contrast, deals with the fullness of revelation through Jesus, the Messiah or Christ, a much shorter period of time, and involves a time where God's people do not have control of society or an ability to defend themselves in some military fashion, or to manifest their own desires when threatened through ways other than suffering and persecution.
You just brought up, you had brought up Genesis, and I wanted to ask you about an issue that some theologians bring up with Genesis, even some lay people, that there are two different creation stories. Explain what the differences are.
Well, people typically refer to Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 as two different creation accounts. They both differ in terms of language and content and even thrust. However, the best way to understand them now is to see Genesis chapter 1 as setting the theological, spiritual parameters and outline by which to understand the more specific story in Genesis chapter 2. So we learn different theological and spiritual lessons from each, understanding chapter 2 not to be separate from chapter 1, but rather a further refinement and detail of what chapter 1 provides on a larger scale.
Well, explain to us the differences.
Well, the differences include that God speaks and creates by a word alone in chapter 1, whereas in chapter 2, he's working with material, clay, to form human beings. In chapter 1, there is a great deal of attention to the creation involving water, whereas in chapter 2, there's a great attention to dry land. There are different, in chapter 1, God creates human beings, male, female, instantaneously at the same time. Whereas in chapter 2, God creates the man, Adam, first, then from him creates the woman, Eve. Some of the differences between the two.
And so which one are we to digest, to believe?
Both. Because chapter 2 gives us detailed information that chapter 1 simply doesn't provide. And because our ancient Hebrew ancestors who provided us these inspired stories were simply not as concerned as maybe we American Christians might be in having everything to be completely harmonized, they had no problem with distinct and different angles of the creation story, just like they had with different angles of the flood account or of the establishment of kingship later in the Bible, where you've got details that don't always fit together, but they're part of a wonderful, multifaceted story that has different angles to it that can't all just be harmonized, squeezed into one nice, neat narrative.
Some of the stories from the Old Testament seem to defy reality. For example, Methuselah living to the age of 1,000, Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt. A lot of people question the story of Noah's Ark.
Yes.
How are we to take these? Which stories are reliable, which are not?
Understanding the Old Testament today involves us knowing what kind of literature we're reading when we read the Old Testament itself, since it's composed over many centuries and involves many different kinds of writing. I will compare this to how we would read a newspaper today. If we pick up a newspaper, it would be disastrous to read an editorial the same way we'd read a news report, or a comic strip the same way we'd read an advertisement.
Okay.
So in the Old Testament, we have different kinds of writing. And the earliest chapters of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, are typically sacred stories that are inspired by God, but are not the same as historical accounts in the books of Samuel and Kings about the rise of Saul and David and Solomon and the establishment of the kingdom and the kingship. So therefore, when we read about Methuselah as a great descendant of Adam and Eve living to be 1,000 years old, we must understand that this is part of sacred story, not a part of history writing. So there is a symbolic way of understanding that doesn't necessarily have to read it as a literal 1,000-year life cycle, but understands how the life cycles diminish over time because of the impact of sin, and that God eventually establishes a life cycle, upper limit of about 120 years, only to preserve us, human beings, falling into greater sin because of longer lifespans. And that, by contrast, the ancient story of Methuselah compared to the ancient Babylonian creation myths is far more reliable, because in the ancient Babylonian myths that predate our sacred stories, the lifespans were 20, 30, 40, and 50,000 years, and these were much less. With Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt, once again, we have very ancient stories, and it's simply impossible for us to know some degree of what actually happened in history, though that may not even be the most important part, because history is not just a matter of what happens, it's a matter of how we understand it.
Sure.
And the way we understand history is significant in Scripture, so that there is no story in the Bible without interpretation and understanding that's inspired by God's Spirit.
There is a lot of history documented in the Old Testament, stories about kings. Why should that matter to us?
It matters because all the stories of God's people are foundational to us understanding who we are as Christians today. It would be the same as if I were to visit you, and let's say there would be a death of a loved one in the family, and everyone would be around talking about stories of what that person meant in their life. So just as I could not get a sense of who a relative of yours might be without the stories told about person, character, places, people, events, humorous, sad, boring in the middle, so for us as believers, all of the stories of our spiritual ancestors, the ancient Israelites, the apostles, the great fathers of the church, and the saints, is all important because it helps inform us as to how we are today, and we learn a great deal from both things they did well in faithfulness to God, things they didn't do well. And so it's all written and inspired for our moral instruction, even today, just as the apostles taught us.
Does the Orthodox Church honor the great figures of the Old Testament, and if so, how?
Emphatically, the Orthodox tradition has honored all the Old Testament figures as glorified saints, right along the apostles of the New Testament and the martyrs, the church fathers and the great ascetics, with feast days. And above all, this is especially apparent on the Sunday before Christmas, when, in the Matins or Orthros service, in the Synaxarion or commemoration, we read all the Old Testament ancestors of Christ, from Adam and Eve, all the way through the patriarchs and matriarchs, the kings and queens, including the prophets and prophetesses, because they were women prophets, and the righteous and noble figures, up to his own parents, Mary and Joseph.
Do we know how important the Old Testament was for Christ?
We do. We have a sharpened understanding of this. Jesus would have grown up in a very devout Jewish household. In that household in Nazareth, he would have been instructed by the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary, on a daily basis about who we are as a people, the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham and the rest, of the Exodus, of the kings, David and Solomon, of the judges like Samuel, of the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah. Jesus would have attended synagogue faithfully every Saturday. He would have heard the Old Testament Psalms. He would have heard the prayers. He would have heard sermons. He would have heard readings from the Torah, from the prophets. It would have informed his life from the inside out, so that as he emerged into adulthood, the Old Testament, which was the only Bible he would have known, was inside his mind and his heart, operating through all of his ministry.
And how did he incorporate the Old Testament in his ministry?
Well, we have an example in the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7 of Matthew, where he explicitly is referring to having come not to destroy the Torah, the commandments and the stories of God's people enshrined in the first 5 books, but rather to fulfill them. We also have examples of how he takes the commandments of the Old Testament and radically internalizes them, so that it's no longer simply a break in one's relationship with God to commit adultery in actual fact externally, but now even thinking about it internally breaks our relationship with God. He referred to Old Testament figures in his first sermon back in Nazareth, where he grew up. In Luke chapter 4, he refers to the prophets Elisha and Elijah and things that they did. He is praying the Psalms even as he's dying on a cross, Psalm 22. And his entire ministry focused on the inbreaking kingdom absolutely has everything to do with what the Old Testament says about who God is, who we are, what the creation is all about, and how God wants to organize our life in this world.
I know some Christians who have never even cracked open the Old Testament. In fact, you can buy copies of the Bible, just the New Testament. How important is the Old Testament to us as Orthodox Christians?
Following what the apostles and the fathers have taught, I would say it's of critical importance, because the New Testament is written out of the raw material of the Old Testament. And the gospel stories of Jesus are precisely in understanding Jesus on the basis of the Old Testament. So therefore, without understanding the Old Testament, we can't understand the New. We will misunderstand the New Testament. We will misunderstand liturgy, epistle, gospel, and the hymns of the church. Whereas the better we understand the Old Testament, the better we understand the New, and vice versa. The New Testament reveals and helps understand and interpret the Old Testament in ways that could never have been anticipated until the Messiah finally showed up in the person of Jesus of Nazareth.
I think you talked about this already, that we use during one service, we talk about some of the people throughout the Old Testament. Do we use other passages from the Old Testament in our worship as Orthodox Christians?
The backbone of Orthodox worship is the book of Psalms. It's everywhere, in the daily offices of the hours, in the Vespers, in the Matins. It's supposed to be in the liturgy, but it dropped out for the most part centuries ago, and we need to recover it, except for some little verses that are sometimes chanted at the antiphons. The Psalms is the book that schools us in how to pray, and my heartfelt conviction as a pastor of 28 years is most of us don't really know how to pray deeply enough, and the Psalms needs to be the way in which we recover that. Athanasius the great church father, said, only through the book of Psalms can we put on Christ and actually assume how we've been baptized and grow up into the Lord. So that's critical. Second book after that is the book of Isaiah, which comes up in the gospel story so much of Jesus, and comes up in some of the services of the church, especially when we read Old Testament at the great feast days, Christmas, Epiphany, and above all, Holy Week and the Easter celebration.
Since you have been a pastor for 28 years, I'm sure you've led many a Bible study. What is the number one question you get from people about the Old Testament?
Gee, why do we have to read this anyway? Can't we just stick with the New Testament? It's so much shorter. It's so much easier. It's so much more appealing to me. That's probably the most common question I've
what
gotten.
led you to take such a fascination with it, to be so fascinated by it?
When I was a theological student here on campus in the late 70s, a couple of my professors observed and took an interest in me and called me in and asked me questions about my future. And they encouraged me to go on for further study. And when I was asked, well, what areas you're interested in, I'd mentioned a few things. And then finally, because I was interested in Bible, I was directly challenged. How about Old Testament? We really need people in the church that do advanced studies in the Old Testament, because nobody ever does that.
Had you thought of that even before they mentioned it?
Never. It was a revelation to me. So I began taking a course in Hebrew in the summer at Harvard Divinity School and hated it for 1 week. And then I crossed a threshold and fell in love with the Hebrew language, and our affair has never ended.
I've never heard anybody say an affair with the Old Testament. And I will say that the Old Testament is very difficult to read, not only because of its length, but because of the various names, and so-and-so begat so-and-so. Why is all of that important?
All of it's important because since the Christian faith is so radically founded on the person, Jesus Christ, and the gospel message proclaimed in his faith, above all, his suffering, crucifixion, death, and resurrection, and the life of Jesus Christ is profoundly intertwined with the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. Therefore, all of those things that informs who Jesus was is now important for us, because it not only informed who Jesus was, what his purpose and mission in life was, but he also changed the way we see the Old Testament. He gave us new eyes to do this, so that it becomes now relevant, meaningful, impactful, and energizing in ways for us that would never have been possible without him.
It seems there are different versions of the Old Testament for different denominations, different Christian denominations. Why is that? What are the differences?
Well, there are, on the one hand, different translations of the Old Testament, just of the New. Hundreds, if not thousands, many of which can be very reliable and useful because they all highlight different things. Of the original languages, Hebrew and Aramaic in the Old Testament and the Greek translation, there are different versions that are read by Christians today, including different versions by Protestant Christians primarily, or by Roman Catholics, or by Orthodox. Some of those differences have to do with the fact that, at least for us Orthodox, there has never been a conciliar definition about what exactly the limits of the Old Testament is. We have shorter canons of 39 books, longer canons of even up to 52 books of the Old Testament.
Isn't it generally considered 49 books?
Well, it is by some, but it's not universal. because once again, we've never had a conciliar definition. There's a very common designation of it being 49 from a version of the Septuagint, the Greek translation, but there's a different version the Ethiopians use or the Slavic churches have used. And there are there are different of opinions in the church fathers about what the number of the Old Testament books is. So while we share 39 basic books with Roman Catholics and Protestants, there are additional books that are called readable in our tradition, anaginoskomena, that we read for profit, even if they may not have the same authority as the main 39. But then again, we share all of those with Roman Catholics with some slight differences. So we have more in common with those readable books with the Catholics than we do with Protestants, but even Protestants are beginning to rediscover them and incorporate them back in their Bible because of the richness of what comes from the teaching of these extra books.
Well, you've been a very enthusiastic supporter of the Old Testament. If somebody is interested in learning more about it, are there resources available for them? What would you say they should read? Obviously, the Old Testament, start from the beginning probably. Other outlets for them?
Well, I would begin by emphasizing that there is nothing that replaces direct contact with the Old Testament itself. Through the worship of the church, the Psalms in prayer, public prayer, private prayer, the stories of the Old Testament as they come to us through the hymns of the church, the commemorations of the church. But for Christians to pick up and read the Old Testament on a regular basis is very dear to my heart and very important for spiritual growth, irreplaceable. Along with that, there are growing resources in English for people. There are the resources of the writings of the fathers of the church that are increasingly being translated. There are writings of good contemporary scholarship that make the biblical resources available in ways that we wouldn't have prior to advances in archaeology and in biblical study that have occurred only in the last few hundred of years. Pastors now have a greater exposure through their education. There are the resources on the internet that are available. There are Orthodox writers writing commentaries increasingly on books of the Old Testament. All of these resources are going to be available increasingly in the coming years, so we have the benefit of them, but nothing replaces our own direct contact without all the other commentary on it.
Father Harry Pappas, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
And please return to view the remaining programs in this series, Discovering Orthodox Christianity. You can find them at youtube.com/Greek Orthodox Church. I'm Stacey Spanos. Thank you for joining us.
Along the crossroads of East and West, and amongst the mightiest of cultures, the island of Cyprus has continued since the dawn of civilization to prosper and create. Cypriots cultivated the land, carved and chiseled rocks, stones, marble, extracted, smelted, and gave forms of art to precious copper, to gold and silver. They accepted and absorbed valuable exchanges and transactions brought to them by sea from countries near and far. The island continued to create relentlessly and create bridges and links between great civilizations. Cyprus culture has existed for millennia and has left indelible footprints deeply engraved on the world's cultural map. The island's civilization was studied and assessed by the world's best scientists and has rightfully earned its position as the core of Mediterranean culture, the cradle of world civilization. Culture is a fundamental human right, a safeguard of human existence and the necessary connection with the past, so as to ensure the correct route to the future. It is an expression of society and an essential tool of education. Culture is one of the most precious human rights. It expresses and praises mankind and its deeds and is found deeply rooted everywhere within the soil, on stone or rock, on clay, canvas or paper. Culture is and always will be one of the most important dimensions of human life.
Whenever there is a war, it's actually women's bodies that are attacked, and the body of a woman is the battlefield. So that's the first target. The second one is the cultural heritage. The libraries, the churches, the holy places. And the third part is the name. To change the names is to change the identity, basically. So this is taking place everywhere in the world where there is a conflict or a war. Cyprus is not an exception. But today, to see this devastation and the dismantling of the old churches and the old European history is, to me, shocking. It's so upsetting, and my heart is full of sorrow. I had to leave a few moments ago. I couldn't see this. It breaks my heart to see that places that people have considered holy are dismantled and vandalized in such an awful way. I mean, it doesn't matter what we do today if the solution of the conflict isn't solved first.
We have, though, international law on our side. There is a very important international treaty called the Hague Convention, which was issued in 1954, and it today has about 115, 120 member states.
I was in the UNESCO board for many years. And of course we could address the problems, we could restore some of the buildings, but if people are still using them over again as barns for their animals, as storage places, if people are vandalizing them, we need protection, first of all.
In the case of northern part of Cyprus, as you know, we have very difficulty in intervening directly because the UN cannot. So we can only appeal to Turkey and whatever entities is there, to respect, because these are things that they belong to international civil society. I mean, they have to respect it.
For over 37 years now, since the Turkish army invaded the territories of the Republic of Cyprus in 1974, Cypriots are deprived of their fundamental right to their culture and civilization. Since then, Cypriot culture has suffered a huge blow. Looting and destruction of Christian monuments, illegal exportation of works of art, illegal excavations within sites belonging to the Department of Antiquities of the Republic. Added to all these insults against world civilization is the illegal demographic alteration. More than 1,600,000 settlers have been brought over from Turkey since 1974, altering in this manner the demographic character of the island. Since 1974, numerous mosques have been built in the occupied part of Cyprus, altering in this way not only the character, but also the history of this island. Greek Cypriots need to show passports in their own country when they want to visit their villages, homes and neighbourhoods, pay entrance fees to visit sites, monuments and churches that belong to them. The original Greek names of the villages of Cyprus are printed on maps dating to the Middle Ages. They are to be found in porcelain charts and the solarea. And yet, Turkish names were given to villages, to roads, to place names, to monuments. Cypriot traditions, cultural richness, all perish under the boots of the Turkish soldiers. World-famous archaeological sites like Engomi, Salamis, Soli and Vouni, temples, theatres, palaces and entire cities, a living proof of our ancestors' presence and creation, are today under Turkish military occupation, with irreversible consequences both for their existence and their physical survival. Museums were looted, private collections sold abroad. International conventions govern archaeological excavations carried out in areas under military occupation. However, these conventions are repeatedly violated, and illegal excavations continue to take place in areas that within the exclusive competence and jurisdiction of the legal state, such as Salamis, Engomi, and Soli. Findings illegally exported, disrupting in this manner the continuity of our civilization. And all this is done without any conviction or any serious consequences for Turkey. Precious samples of Cypriot culture were found in Western markets and the US. Treasures of Cypriot antiquity, priceless Byzantine icons and mosaics, manuscripts, paintings, books, all sold, while the entire civilized world watched with indifference the huge theft and fraud that was and still is being carried out against a culture and a civilization. The 575 Christian monasteries, churches and chapels are held hostage by the Turkish army that continues to occupy the northern part of Cyprus. Churches belonging to the Orthodox, the Catholic, the Anglicans, the Maronites, the Armenians, places of Christian prayer and worship, most in terrible condition. Some turn to warehouses or junkyards or restaurants, all unprotected uncared, empty of the valuable and cherished contents, all left wide open to the northerly winds and rain. The occupation regime allows the Greek Cypriot displaced people to perform the divine liturgy to a very limited number of churches in their native towns, and only once or twice a year. Even in these rare occasions, the occupation regime imposes arbitrary restrictions. People are not allowed to pray in their churches. People cannot exercise this basic human right. Since 1974, 19 churches and chapels dating from the 15th to the 19th centuries have been completely destroyed, eradicated from the cultural map. 100 churches are in a terrible state and are in imminent danger of collapsing. 85 churches were turned into mosques. And yet, the government of Cyprus has restored a very important holy place for the Muslims, Hala Sultan Tekke, whereas it takes particular care and restores Ottoman monuments and places of worship. A Gothic church in Nicosia, St. Mary of the Augustines, that was transformed to a mosque in 1570 and belongs to the Antiquities Department of the Republic of Cyprus, was offered to the Muslim population in Nicosia for their religious needs. For over 37 years, the legitimate government of the Republic of Cyprus calls for help and sympathy from the civilized world to save all these monuments. These monuments do not belong only to the Cypriots. They belong to the global community.
See, for us, heritage is not political. Because for us, of course, heritage is an expression of culture, an expression of human society, human history, and so on. So for us, it's normal to see heritage as a common.
In the 21st century, the rich, ancient civilization of Cyprus, a member state of the European Union, is threatened by the continuing illegal military occupation of over a third of its territory by Turkey. Rescuing these monuments should be the duty of all.
Προσφυλείς μου αδελφοί και αδελφές, Χριστός Ανέστη, αληθώς Ανέστη ο Κύριος. Τη λαμπρή αυτή μέρα της Αναστάσεως του Κυρίου σας χαιρετώ με βαθιά αγάπη και άρρητη χαρά και εκφράζω θερμότατες ευχές για ένα Πάσχα γεμάτο αγαλίαση ψυχής και ανανεωμένη ελπίδα. Είναι Πάσχα πραγματικής χαράς και αγαλιάσεως, διότι παρά τις θλίψεις, τις δυσκολίες και τα αδιέξοδα που βιώνουμε, γιορτάζουμε την Ανάσταση του Χριστού, την οριστική νίκη του επί του κακού, της αμαρτίας και του θανάτου. Έζησε τον χειρότερο θάνατο, υπέστη την φοβερότερη επίθεση του κακού και γεύθηκε την απόλυτη ανθρώπινη απόρριψη. Σταυρώθηκε, αλλά αναστήθηκε. Ενίκησε οριστικά το κακό και τον θάνατο. Μας αποδέσμευσε από την τυραννία της αμαρτίας και της ενοχής. Γι' αυτό και η χαρά ανθίζει σήμερα στην καρδιά μας. Γι' αυτό και ψάλλουμε χαρά στα πάντα πεπλήρωτε της Αναστάσεως την πήραν η λιφότα. Εμείς ως πιστοί στον Αναστάντα Χριστό μοιραζόμαστε την εμπειρία της Αναστάσεως και γιορτάζουμε το Μέγα και ιερότατο Πάσχα, όχι μόνο ως Πάσχα ουσιαστικής χαράς, αλλά και ως Πάσχα ανανεωμένης ελπίδος, διότι η Ανάσταση του Χριστού ανανεώνει και θεμελιώδη την ελπίδα για ένα καλύτερο αύριο, για ένα καλύτερο κόσμο και για ένα μέλλον άξιο του ανθρώπου ως τέκνου του Θεού. Αυτή η ανανεωμένη ελπίδα, επειδή βασίζεται στην Ανάσταση του Χριστού, δεν πεθαίνει ποτέ, ακόμη και υπό τις χειρότερες συνθήκες. Παραμένει ζωντανή και δυναμική, πλημμυρισμένη με το ανέσπερο φως της Αναστάσεως. Προσφυλείς μου αδελφοί και αδελφές, ας γεμίσουμε λοιπόν την καρδιά μας αυτό το Πάσχα με βαθύτατη χαρά και ακατανίκητη ελπίδα και ας αγκαλιάσουμε και χαιρετήσουμε ο ένας τον άλλο με τον υπέροχο χαιρετισμό ζωής και αυθαρσίας, με το Χριστός Ανέστη.